This week in Pure Reinvention.
We had to come up with a way to satisfy the creditors without compromising the essence of Detroit, because I thought it would be a tragedy to liquidate one of the great art collections in the world.
The Honorable Gerald E. Rosen, U.S. District Court and Principal Architect of the Detroit bankruptcy.
Engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
Welcome to Pure Reinvention and welcome to the month of February. I want to welcome our co-host for the month of February, Amy Frankman. Amy, thank you for being here.
You're welcome, Mike. Thank you.
Amy is the executive director of the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association, a very successful association who has over the years done a tremendous job of reinventing itself under your leadership. So, Amy, we're really excited to have you listen to some of the podcasts for February and give us your feedback. So you had a chance, Amy, to listen to some of the comments from Judge Rosen, and you created a long list, didn't you?
I did. I got so much out of this podcast. While the topic and health of Detroit is so important to the entire state of Michigan, from this podcast, there was one thing in particular that really struck home for me. It was when Judge Rosen said, "What have I gotten myself into?"
And on that point, let's listen.
Have you enjoyed our Pure Reinvention podcast? Are you ready to begin your own Pure Reinvention journey? Join our next Starters Experience May 4 through 5 and May 24 through 25 in Detroit. Learn the 5 fundamentals in an engaging and interactive way. Contact us at purereinvention.com today.
We're very excited today to be able to have as our podcast guest Judge Gerald Rosen, one of the primary judges involved with the municipal bankruptcy of Detroit. Judge Rosen, thank you for agreeing to be here.
Good to be here, Mike.
In our conversation before we started taping, Judge Rosen, you started to explain to me that you approached the Detroit bankruptcy in your role in it a little different. Can you explain how Detroit became, for you, a little different kind of a project than typical?
Sure, Mike. The problems in Detroit were of such a long-standing nature and had built up over decades that it really required a different approach than I would normally take to bringing parties together to resolve a commercial dispute of some sort, because those disputes are pretty much just binary, and they're disputes between companies or people, and they're pretty one-dimensional or two-dimensional. Detroit was dimensional on many, many, many different levels. There were 170,000 creditors. There was $18.5 billion in debt, a pension system that was $3.5 billion underfunded, and a city that was, in terms of what bankruptcy experts called service delivery insolvent, which really means that it wasn't functioning as a city. Services, basic public services were not being provided, and the city wasn't paying for basic rights that people have, their pension rights, their health care rights that they contractually owned. And the biggest problem we had was that behind all of this, the city had no assets. 42% of all of the city's revenues from every source were committed to legacy costs, pension and health care for retirees, and that number was going to go to 67% in 4 to 5 years. It had no readily monetizable asset base that could be used to pay creditors. So we had to think outside the box a little bit, and we had to come up with a way to satisfy the creditors without compromising the essence of Detroit, so that on the other side of the bankruptcy, Detroit would be a viable entity and hopefully a thriving entity. The only asset the city had that all of the creditors were looking to monetize was the art collection at the DIA. That was the only asset. And all of the creditors, whether it was the retirees or the financial creditors, all of the creditors wanted to liquidate the art and use that to pay the debt.
When did you begin to recognize that you were going to have to employ a different solution than typical in order to help the city achieve its next phase?
Well, it sort of happened over time, but really right at the very beginning, I had a golf vacation scheduled with my 15-year-old son, and I didn't want to break that. It was right after
Smart man, by the way.
I was named as a mediator. And I put together a stack of reading about not just the debt structure and what a municipal bankruptcy is, but really a deep dive into Detroit and its dysfunction over decades and how it got to where it was. And I was just getting up very early every morning, and by early I mean 4:30, 5 o'clock, and reading through this stuff. And it included newspaper articles. Kevin Orr had put together what was called a proposal for creditors, which was much more than just a proposal. It was a very deep dissection of Detroit's financial and operational dysfunction. And I think it was during that trip at some point that I realized that this was an assetless bankruptcy. And I thought, there was one moment, Mike, when I was very early in the morning sitting at the dining room table in this little condo I was staying at, when I thought, what the hell have I gotten myself into? My job is to get deals. I had the back room, and Steve Rhodes, the judge, had the front room. My job was to get deals. To get deals, you need assets and revenue, assets that could be converted to revenue, and there was nothing other than the art collection. So I began to think about ways in which the art could be monetized without liquidating it, because I thought it would be a tragedy to liquidate one of the great art collections in the world for many reasons, not just one or two or three. There were many reasons why it would have been a tragedy for Detroit. But you start with this. Detroit had been cannibalizing its heritage and its history to mortgage its future for decades. What was the point of cannibalizing its greatest gem, its most historical cultural gem, to mortgage its future again for a one-time payment to creditors? It would have solved nothing.
That took a tremendous amount of creativity to recognize that one of your roles before you could even go to work was breaking that old momentum of cannibalization in order to start a whole next round of sound decision making that would help the city move forward. So where did
I suppose in retrospect that's an accurate description, but believe me, I was in the vortex,
yes.
Of a lot of incoming fire.
Yeah.
I'd like to think I was thinking on that level, but I was trying to take what had been presented in the media and by everybody as a binary equation, the art versus, for example, the retirees. And there were lots of tensions within that binary equation. You had a racial component to that, which, of course, I'm from this area. I grew up and spent my life here. So lurking beneath the surface is always racial tension in Detroit. And that was definitely in the bankruptcy. I mean, we had demonstrations virtually every day outside our courthouse, largely African-American folks who were dependent on their pensions from Detroit, firefighters, police officers, garbage collectors, all the people who had given their working life to Detroit were largely African American. And yet the Detroit Institute of Arts was being presented as sort of an elite preserve of the suburban cultural elite. That was a very ugly narrative that was developing in the bankruptcy. So there was that aspect, the necessity to solve it. There was also another important aspect that I hadn't even thought of till I went on the DIA website, which was the DIA was drawing about 600,000 people a year to Midtown, which was at that point one of the nascently growing areas of Detroit, one of the few nascently growing areas of Detroit. To have liquidated the DIA would have been like dropping a hydrogen bomb in the middle of Midtown. It would have sucked the life right out of it. So I thought about that. I was not a DIA person. Like every kid in Southeast Michigan, I went to the DIA on a field trip, but I was not a DIA person. But I did go to their website and I looked at their board of directors. And their board of directors is sort of a who's who of Detroit and the region. And the region had invested in Detroit the year before with the millage. So I saw this as a potential continuation of the tension between the DIA and its supporters and the suburbs and Detroit and the pensioners and retirees, because, the DIA was raising money for a litigation fund to protect the art. So I just thought that it was this binary equation that was out there, and we had to find a way to resolve this. So one morning, I had a legal pad in front of me that I had made notes on all the papers, but the cardboard backing of it was still there. So I had this idea, and I drew a circle to the left, and in the circle I put state, and then I drew a circle in the middle in which I put art, and then I drew another circle to the right in which I put pensions. And then I put arrows from the state with dollar signs to the art, and then arrows from the art to the pensions with dollar signs. And then I drew a box around the art to indicate we would kickstart funding from the state to protect the art in some kind of a trust, lock the art off from all of the creditors other than the retirees, and give the proceeds to the pensions. I thought that was a good way to start. And then I wrote down below that a bunch of questions that immediately came from that, because it was a pretty crazy idea. That doodle, I'm a compulsive doodler, and that doodle is now hanging in the DIA as sort of symbolic of the core of the resolution of the Detroit bankruptcy. That was how it started. There was a personal aspect to this, as there often is. I mean, as I'm sitting there and thinking about, liquidating this precious, incredible cultural treasure that Detroit has, I'm thinking, great, my legacy is going to be the guy who liquidated this legacy to sell off paintings to sheiks in Dubai and oligarchs.
Became the last nail in our coffin.
Yeah, and oligarchs in Russia. That's going to be my legacy.
Yeah.
I didn't
want that.
Didn't want that.
When you talk about creativity, if you were to give advice to other for-profit, not-for-profit, municipality, who are all headed down a path where their obligations are going to exceed their revenue streams, municipalities who are beginning to show evidence of some of the same characteristics that Detroit was experiencing, with more obligation than what they have revenue stream for. Judge Rosen, how do you begin to give them advice on how to approach their next chapter?
Mike, far be it from me. I mean, I'm a judge. I'm not, I don't have a magic wand. And we have so many cities today, municipalities, municipal governments, counties as well, that are on the same precipice as Detroit was with their legacy funding, pensions and OPEBs, and yet they don't want to recognize it. Chicago, I hate to use one example, but Chicago is $65 billion underfunded on their legacy costs. Detroit was $8.5 billion or $9 billion underfunded, including their healthcare costs. It's a staggering number, but yet Chicago and many, many other cities continue to make the same mistakes. They keep trying to tax their way out of it. When Detroit tried to tax their way out of it over decades, people left.
Right.
Because they were paying more and more and receiving less and less in terms of the services. My advice to people who are trying to grapple with this is get out of the river Nile, get out of denial, and confront the realities. It's very difficult to do because there are so many political pieces to this. I mean, there are vested interests everywhere.
Well, as you described, there's all these competing interests for everybody to make sure they're taking care of themselves.
Look, the path of least resistance, political least resistance, is to tax and to borrow. That's what Detroit did for decades. Increased taxes. Detroit had the highest property taxes in the state, and they were providing less and less services for it. And borrowing. Detroit was at its statutory borrowing limit in 2005, and yet it circumvented that limit and borrowed another $1.5 billion, which ultimately ended up tipping the city into bankruptcy. That's just not a path for resolution of problems. You have to resolve the underlying structural problems. Easy for me to say as an independently appointed, life-tenured federal judge. I don't have to run for election. These are politicians who make these decisions that have to run for election. But at some point, you're putting the enterprise at risk. And that's what happened in Detroit. It's what's happening in Chicago. Puerto Rico I can't even begin to talk about the problems in Puerto Rico. More than $70 billion in financial debt, more than $35 billion in pension debt, conservatively estimated, probably much more than that. People have to start focusing on what the underlying structural problems are. And these structural problems are many. It's not just political lack of will. On the legacy side, it's the demographic problem. You know, back when these pension systems were designed, you had 6 or 8 people supporting every retiree. Now you have one. It's an inverted triangle now. And these are, this is happening everywhere. It's happening actually at the federal government level with Social Security and Medicare, but the federal government can print money, which is what we're doing.
What one thing in your background really made a difference in helping you be open to figuring this out?
One of the things, if you're in the middle of something like this, you have to be tenacious and persistent. I am a pretty persistent, tenacious guy. And I think I got that in competitive sports. I was a competitor. I was a high school and college tennis player. I probably won a few matches that I had no business winning. I beat people who were much better tennis players than me just because my tennis game was run down every ball and hit one more ball over the net than the other guy hit over the net. Right. I learned it from my dad, who was a professional baseball player who had a lot of those same qualities.
Most good leaders like yourself have a mentor somewhere back in the background.
Mentors is what it's all about. And I've had great mentors throughout my personal and my professional life, just some of the greatest people.
I think you and I would both agree that anybody who would come to us and ask for advice, one of the biggest ones we would give them is find good mentors to surround yourself with and build a good team.
In my world, we say you need a rabbi.
So you're about to embark on another big adventure. Tell us about what you're about to do.
So in a couple weeks, I'm going to leave the judiciary after 27 years, an institution which I love. But after 32 years of public service, it's time to do something different. I'm going to, with Steve Rhodes, who was the bankruptcy judge and my partner in the bankruptcy, Steve and I are going to open a arbitration and mediation service organization here in Detroit. We're going to open the Detroit office of a company called JAMS, Judicial Arbitration Mediation Services, which is the largest provider of alternative dispute resolution services in the world. It's an international company. Detroit will be their 27th office, and it speaks to where Detroit is now. 5 years ago, an international legal organization like JAMS would never have thought of coming to Detroit. But they called me back in March and asked me if I was interested in opening a Detroit office. They said they had been following what's been happening in Detroit with great interest. They're in all of the other major cities in the country, as well as some cities in Europe. And they said they wanted to be part of Detroit's rebirth. And they asked me if I would be interested and if I knew of anybody else. And I immediately thought of Judge Rosen. And we're going to be joined by one of my oldest friends who actually recruited me for Miller Canfield 40 years ago, Rocky Posa, Clarence Posa, and a former justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, Mary Beth Kelly. It'll be the four of us to start. We're talking to some other people, and we start February 1st. I hope we can do it to help people, to help professional organizations, to help companies around the country, maybe around the world, come together, and to bring some folks into Detroit that might not otherwise come to Detroit. We're going to have a center here in Detroit for mediation and arbitration to resolve disputes. It'll be a nice office in a nice building on the river. And when I talk to lawyers around the country who know I'm doing this, they're very excited about coming to Detroit.
You don't even have to be an attorney to be excited about that.
Well, they're excited. I'll tell you, this is interesting. I was at a conference in San Diego with some of the major lawyers in the country, the biggest cases. And we were out to dinner, and they were very excited about having a center in Detroit and I hadn't really focused on this, but they said, you've got one of the best airports in the world. You can fly into Detroit.
From anywhere in the world.
From anywhere in the world, and you can be downtown in 25 minutes. You can stay in Detroit at a very nice hotel for half the price that it costs in New York. You don't have to take a taxi from the hotel to the mediation. The great restaurants that cost about half what the restaurants cost in New York and L.A. and Washington. And we can't wait till you open. So we hope that this will bring a lot of folks to Detroit that might not otherwise have come to have their disputes resolved.
Pure Reinvention is very fortunate to have had the opportunity to spend this time with you this morning. We have learned that through the leadership abilities of individuals like yourself and individuals like Julie Owen, who is a member of your team, and an individual who we have found to have incredible insight into success.
Julie is the definition of a disruptor.
Well, in a nice way, because
in a good way.
I think,
in the
I
positive
think while
way.
she's disrupting you, she's got the biggest smile on her face as she's really being tickled at being disruptive. But it is through you, the two of you, being true heroes to the city of Detroit and its ability to create a positive outcome that allows others to come and interact with individuals like yourself to start to learn that the real core is about creating more heroes and less villains and finding your way to any new bargain that allows your municipality or business or even your own personal life to succeed. And for that, we thank you for your great work.
Thank you, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
So, Amy, you're right. This first podcast with Judge Rosen was absolutely outstanding. I want to go back to a comment you made in the intro when you said there were a couple of key points that really struck you as a leader. And one was the comment you made, Amy, about how Judge Rosen asked himself, how did he get involved in this and what it meant? Kind of that overwhelmed feeling when you finally realize you've really grabbed a hold of something big. What does that mean to you as a leader?
Well, it was the process that he went down. There were several discoveries that the judge made when he began on this journey. He really didn't know. And to me, that's with anything that we do new with our businesses, our association. And some of the things that he discovered, when I think about it, we also have the same problems or the same discoveries. We find the same things. The one thing that I really resounded with me was service, delivery, and solvent. We have an association, and how many of the things that we do for our members that we think are helping, are they really services that they still need?
Right.
Should we be taking a look at them? Have they become insolvent?
And you think at some point that any service that might have been outstanding at one point may have at a later point become less valuable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And if you don't look at it, though, and if you don't think about it.
Right.
Yeah, so this led me to those thoughts. What are we doing that we could be doing better? We could be doing differently, more efficient.
It's kind of like doing your own internal audit of whether some of the things some of your deliverables are indeed as valuable as you intend for them to be.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as reported by your customers rather than internally, right?
Exactly.
It's the external report card, not the internal one.
Exactly. The other point that he made, or the other discovery that he discovered a dysfunction over decades.
Okay.
So what happened in Detroit did not happen overnight.
Right.
It's been building for many, many years.
Yes.
And when you think about dysfunction over decades, you look at your board of directors, and not necessarily the people that sit in the seats, but how we as leaders, how we conduct a board meeting. There are some times when I have a board meeting and I finish the board meeting and I think, what did I do to initiate that conversation and that discussion?
To break the old pattern.
Yeah, we had the same agenda. We went through the same thing.
Yep.
So it's kind of our form of dysfunction over decades.
So the success of the board meeting is whether we were able to put a check mark by all the parts of our agenda as opposed to did I really have the robust discussion around whatever specifically I wanted to pull out of this very important group of people.
Right, exactly. And I think it's in the way that we present it.
Sure.
If you put it in the same agenda, the same looking thing, unless you shake it up a little bit and make some changes, and I think we're going to continue on the same path that we've always gone on, similar to Detroit.
So you're contending that one of the roles of a key leader like yourself is that you have to reposition things like that to not have the same pattern exhibit itself. Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful point. And I think over time, our behavior does become dysfunctional. It becomes so repetitive, becomes so outdated, and we don't even realize it. We actually have lulled into the comfort and security of same behavior, right? Which we're all guilty of.
Right. And that is a comfortable, safe place.
Sure. So that actually is a huge segue into the second thing that I heard you say, which was at some point, Judge Rosen realized he'd really grabbed a hold of something big here. Quite daunting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I can only imagine how he felt when he realized, when he started making these discoveries and just what he had to do, what he had to accomplish. In comparison to what everyday leaders go through, it's nothing. But then again, if that's your world, that is everything. Mm-hmm. So what I really thought was great was the solution. When he started breaking things down, writing them out, putting them down in paper and just breaking it down, he realized there was another point that I just loved. He realized by doing the solution that everyone expected, he was putting the enterprise at risk. And I thought that
by following the old agenda.
Yes. And that was what everyone expected him to do. And at that point, it was pivotal because he had to either just go with the flow, continue the dysfunction.
That'd have been the easy way.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And in his shoes, I may have chosen to do that. Or he could be the true leader and he could break away from that and make his way, which is what he did.
And as a result, got credit for being the architect of the grand bargain, which was a very, very pivotal point in this entire story. If you're intrigued with the story that goes with Judge Rosen, we have a treat for you. We have 15 minutes of Judge Rosen's case manager interviewing Judge Rosen, and you just shouldn't miss it. But here's the catch. You have to give us your email address. So if you'll go in right now and give us your email address on our website, it will then allow you to access a never-before-heard conversation that Judge Rosen is having with his case manager about the grand bargain, about how Judge Rosen approached the work, and I think you'll find it would be a very valuable 15 minutes spent. So do that right now. Go to our website, put in your email address, listen to that story. So if you're ready for a change, make it a change that lasts, make it pure reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.